Hi, this is Leo Volont. This is part one of my 7-part series. Democracy is a bad thing. This chapter is the social contract. In this episode, we discuss the social contract theory, focusing on Thomas Hobbes and his very dark natural state of man, and how authoritarian government can ride to the rescue. We put Hobbes into his social political context of the 17th century, in which authoritarianism proves just the thing we need in order to pave the way to the 18th century age of enlightenment, where it all comes unraveled again. You can read along from my blog, which you can find by searching Leo Volont blog.spot, or the name of my blog is Leo Volont Spirituality Dreams Religion, History, Politics, etc. And this title will be close to the top of the queue. Note that the number in my hat is the paragraph number you can use to find your place on my blog. It also helps me to keep this video shoot organized. Let's begin. When appraising democracy as a system of government, we need to evaluate it in terms of how well it does the job of governing. Then the problem arises where many people believe that government, that is, any system of government, is inherently bad in proportion to its demonstrated ability and capacity to actually govern. They envision a continuum between good and evil and equate freedom with the good, and they equate evil with any restriction of freedom. They can't imagine anything else besides government ever restricting their freedom, and so all evil is attributed to government. They only have derogatory terms for effective government. They call it tyranny and dictatorship. If some democracy somewhere does manage to get a large majority mandate, then even there the typical free democracies of the world sneer and accuse it of authoritarianism. We get the ironic paradox whereby democracy is considered good in proportion to how badly it actually does the job of governing. Checks and balances that lead to institutional paralysis are listed as democracy's primary virtues. But the same checks and balances, if they were found in private enterprise or even in running of a charitable hospital, they would be considered as the grossest inefficiencies, as wasteful as the vice of profligacy. We get quotes like, democracy is the worst form of government in the world except for all the others. But again, this shows the conservative private sector's predisposition to assign degrees of evil to government in proportion to how well and completely it can govern. And yep, that involves the government's capacity to exercise control and to restrict private freedoms in order to maintain the public good. You can't protect the sheep without cracking the whip on the wolves. Now, yes, I realize I will be fighting against a strong headwind of popular opinion if I attempt to present authoritarian government as good and list as bad what it is that weakens effective authoritarian government, and that democracy is therefore bad because it is horrible at actually doing what governments should be able to do. But allow me to go ahead and try anyway. So, okay, why is effective government a good thing? I don't need to reinvent the wheel for any of this. Theory of government has been thoroughly discussed, and by better minds than my own. A good place to start would be with a review of the social contract theory of government. What I remember from my readings of history is that Thomas Hobbes kicked off the debate with the publication of his book Leviathan in 1651. But perhaps we can use a little review of 17th century European history so that we can establish some kind of meaningful context for our discussion of the social contract theory of government. Yes, Hobbes was still writing as the English Civil War was still smoldering, still erupting into flames once in a while. Hobbes had been a loyalist and advocated for absolute centralized government. He didn't need to be especially imaginative or a very creative thinker. He only had to keep his eyes and ears open. Hobbes had grown up as a contemporary to Louis XIII of France and his very influential chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, who led the way towards centralizing power in France and popularizing the idea of giving absolute power to the monarchs. But perhaps the biggest rock star at the time had been Louis XIV. Hobbes would have known him as a still young king busy fighting the Fronde civil wars, firstly to suppress his parliament and secondly to put his barons in their place. Tired of constant civil conflict, the people of France generally supported the king, presaging Hobbes' argument that the best guarantee for peace is a strong central power. France was then rising to the zenith of its power and influence, and the English could hardly have failed to notice. England's own experiments with parliamentarism had led to its civil war, and so Hobbes may have been impressed at the time by the contrast of English failure against French success. But with the 18th century, we would get what is referred to variously as the Age of Reason or the Age of Enlightenment, where the social contract theory was extensively tinkered with. The powers that Hobbes would give to authority to protect the peace and order of society, the great thinkers of the Enlightenment would claw back bit by bit, clause by clause, until by the 19th century we were all well on our way into the age of democracy that would bring in its wake all the ensuing wars, civil wars, revolutions, economic, social, and political, that now leave the world on the brink of extinction. But yeah, just to get it straight in our minds, let's look at the basic terms of Hobbes' argument for absolute government. His view was that in a pure state of nature, man could advance to the limits of his own personal power, up to the point where he would be opposed by the powers of others. And it would be those kind of clashes between competing self-interests that would create a state of war of every man against all others. Life under these conditions would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The remedy for such an abysmal state of affairs would be for all to agree to submit their claims and disputes to some absolute authority, whether that be a man or a council of men. Given the social and political context at the time, with both Britain and the continent plunged into wars and civil conflicts, we can understand the general wish to make sacrifices for the sake of peace, sweet peace. In addition to the Civil War in England, the continent was occupied with the wars of the Spanish Succession, and Germany in particular had its raging 30 Years' War and peasants' rebellions. So yeah, the 17th century was a huge mess, and the people were eager for remedies. An authoritarian crackdown would have been the answer to their prayers. Well, it was like the universe actually listened to Hobbes. The anarchism of the English Civil War was rejected and the kings were restored. Europe, never completely quiet, was in a state of relative peace when compared to the chaos of the decades before, and French hegemony created a bit of breathing room for everybody. Well, you know how they say within every blessing there lies a curse? Well, relative peace made it seem like the world was really okay again. Everybody was like, why did we ever think there was a problem? That Thomas Hobbes was so dark and cynical, wasn't he? So within 2 generations, the intellectual elite and the Enlightenment philosophers decided they could take peace for granted. That peace that had only been imposed upon them by royal authoritarianism. Their logic must have been something like, the umbrella keeps us dry, so I guess we don't need the umbrella anymore. But in this world of ours, it's always the rainy season. So tear up the social contract and up the revolutions. Part 2 is coming soon. We'll discuss the salient transformative elements in the 18th century Age of Enlightenment that were the necessary preludes to the Industrial Revolution and the age of democracy. See you soon. Let me see if I can turn this thing off.